Hello, so I'm very delighted to be joined by Billy Abbott from the Whisky Exchange. Hello, Billy.
Hello, how you doing?
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Well, anything, you give me something to do in the evening, keep me off the streets, all the important things.
Well, you're a man that for many people you don't need an introduction. So many people have seen you, of course, at tasting events and through your work from the Whisky Exchange, and all the other things that you do as an educator, a writer, a blogger, and I've also heard that you're also a very nice chap as well. So, but if you could just maybe just give us a little bit of background about yourself. I heard that you used to work in IT. So how does someone go from working in IT to getting a job, being paid to talk about and drink whiskey? I mean, where did it all go wrong?
So when I was a boy, so my family has a long relationship with booze. Not until more recently, actually, not really a professional relationship, which sounds really bad. But my mum and dad were big fans of wine tastings when I was a kid. So I grew up in a family where we went to wine tastings. My dad used to get in potty pins of beer for Christmas. We had a local brewery. I may talk in the past about how Thursday the whole town smelled of beer because it was brew day, and so the smell of brewing beer is the smell of Thursdays when I was 6 years old playing the school playground. So I grew up this whole booze in the background thing, and I was a big beer fan. So I went to university, big beer fan, worked in the Union Bar, was one of the people who looked after the casks of beer there's two sides of our bar, one with lots of fizzy lager, the other side with a couple of casks of ale. I helped look after the casks of ale. That was my thing. I ran the Ale Society for the university. And then I discovered in my sometime at university, I'm still trying to remember exactly when it would be, but probably sort of like late 90s. Yes, because despite my beautiful appearance, I'm much younger than I seem. So late 90s when I was at university, I discovered whiskey. And that just sat there as a background thing for years afterwards. Then I went to work in IT. I worked in financial data. I was a scary mainframe programmer. This is a 90s metal beard and mainframe programmer beard, not a hipster beard. This is started in the early 2000s. So there we go. But
okay.
yeah, so
I'm a little bit behind.
That's all right. Yeah, just work on it. You've got another lockdown coming up. Yeah, it's excellent timing. So yeah. But yeah, so I had a job working in IT, and my hobby after a few years became booze. So I started drinking whiskey and running whiskey tastings for friends of mine. Other friends of mine were into whiskey as well. We sort of learned a bit more about it. I joined the Scotch Whisky Society. But then I had a second hobby which sort of strangely developed, which was writing. When I was at school, I was predicted to fail English at GCSE. And I had an incredible English teacher who sort of taught me how to write a load more. And I found this love of writing, and I ended up going to an event in 2009 I think it was. Anyway, it's about a decade ago, and it was called the Blaggers Banquet, and it was for a bunch of food bloggers, including myself, who blagged Hawksmoor for an evening, and we blagged a load of food and a load of drink, and we did a £50 a head meal, which gave all the money to charity, because it was one of those eras where bloggers are all after free stuff. And I helped run the bar, and people said, why don't you write about booze? Why you write about food? You write at, but booze is your thing. So yeah. All right. Woke up the next morning with a hangover and a blog, having registered and built a blog while absolutely hammered after the event. A bottle of coffee Galliano.
Oh, nice.
Not good. So anyway, no, and so after about a year or so of writing, I tried to blag my way into some tastings for the Whisky Exchange for free. I was still working in IT, 24-hour call out. I was a software engineer, manager, head of training, head of recruiting, and all these other things, having worked at a company for 10 years. And ended up going to what turned out to be a job interview rather than me trying to blag my way into some tastings for free. And they offered me the job and said, do you want to be a writer? There's only one other writer in the company. You would join him as writer and subject matter expert for the company. We like the fact that you don't only know about whiskey, you know about other stuff. And I did. I took a horrifically large pay cut. And 9.5 years, well, April, May next year is my 10th anniversary at the Whisky Exchange, my 10th anniversary of working in booze full time. But yeah, so hobby, accidentally got a job. 10 years later, I occasionally write code for fun. So, you know.
Well, I mean, it's an incredible journey, though. It's weird. I've spoken to other people that a similar kind of thing where, but a lot of people say that, you know, when you find something you really love, and it's almost like the obstacles clear from your path, and it's meant to be. And I don't know, does it actually feel like work to you, the kind of work you do, or do you enjoy it so much that it's actually, you know, the kind of dream for the whiskey enthusiast?
I'm really lucky because I've only actually really had 2 jobs. 3 if you include the time I used to work in a bar, which I used to really like. 4 if you include that startup I worked for in my gap year sandwich course thing at university. Anyway, I've enjoyed all of them, all of my jobs. I've been one of those annoying people who's loved what they did. My previous job for whiskey, absolutely loved it, and I would have stayed there quite happily. Although I've heard now that it's all turned a little bit annoying, and all my friends have been fired. So that bit, I'm quite happy to be out of it. But it is a job, and this is one of the things people forget often, is the fact that what I do is not just all for fun. It is really, I wouldn't do it if I didn't enjoy it. If it wasn't the thing I love doing, I would have to try and find something else. I'm unfortunately one of those people who's not very good at doing things they don't love doing, which is why I'm so fortunate to have had my jobs I have.
Absolutely.
But it's really hard work. I was on 24-hour call out for 10.5 years in my last job. I worked every Christmas day. I have pictures of me and other people wearing stupid hats on Christmas Day to try and be vaguely pleased about the fact we were fixing bloody financial indices at 4 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve, you know, that sort of thing. But I loved it. You know, but it was really hard work. In fact, my job currently is harder work. Involves a lot more organisation, a lot more moving parts than I thought. And it's one of these things that I'm very fortunate in that I have this quite varied background from my interests outside of my IT role. I worked in IT, was a computer programmer, did some web design, did a load of stuff with social media back before we had the term social media. Used to be a photographer, used to help on film sets. And so I've got all these random things. And so all of that comes together. I do a little bit of everything now.
So it's a perfect fit for the Whisky Exchange, which so you are good, not only just a great whiskey writer and enthusiast and judge and educator, but of course you've got those IT skills when things go wrong on that side as well.
I've written for the Whisky Exchange 1 line of code in almost 10 years. And that was 9 years ago from about now, where the head of IT was on holiday and we couldn't get in contact with him. So I guessed and uploaded a single change and it worked and the website didn't break. I have never, ever written another line of code for us again. So, but it's one of those weird things that I talk between the different departments and I help translate and try and I work just in general I try and bring people together and try and help people understand each other. And that's what I try and do with the drinks world, not only with whiskey, but with all other drinks I work with, is trying to show people what they are and helping people understand them. And I do that within the Whisky Exchange as well, as various different ways, including being head of training, but also being the person who talks between different departments sometimes. And
there's one thing that I've always wanted, and I haven't actually asked this question, and I'm sure you get asked it a lot. But someone like yourself, who you're traveling around, you're going to different places around the world, you're hosting events in normal times. Of course, now there's a lot of like Zoom tastings, all that kind of stuff. How does someone like yourself, who is surrounded by us, who's doing all these tastings all the time, how do you kind of look after yourself? Because of course you can't taste every single thing that's put in front of you, and how do you manage your schedule? Do you like a week on, week off, or how do you look after your liver essentially?
I spit a lot of whiskey out basically.
Okay.
I don't, during the day, when I write tasting notes and things like that, when I do judging and things like that, I don't drink. At the same time, I don't look after myself very well, and that is a problem. So be good, everybody. Look after yourselves better than me. Yes. So I have my lockdown gut and everything at the moment. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing to do. So make sure you go for your walk every day. Make sure you drink in moderation. Don't do what I do.
And how do you think is with the lockdowns, all those kind of things recently, and of course now sadly we're going into another lockdown. Has that you must have seen a massive shift in your kind of work pattern? So there's been a big change into online tastings and things. Do you think in a way that may have actually in some way benefited the whiskey industry a little bit, where people that were maybe a little bit intimidated or a bit shy to go to a whiskey in-person tasting, and now like from home thinking, well, okay, I'm not too shy to try this. I can do it from the comfort of my own home. But do you think there's been more people introduced to whiskey for the first time as a one positive thing from lockdown?
I think it's a bit of a balance. I don't think it's changed much. I think it's overall it's about the same. The way I described it, a friend of mine, journalist at the beginning of lockdown, asked me about this, and I described it then exactly as I still do. I'm quite impressed with myself. I think I actually came up with a vague idea of my own for once. I described it as an acceleration. I said that lockdown will cause the way that we do things at the moment to accelerate. So people were gradually accepting online stuff. I've done online tastings before. I've been doing tweet tastings. I think I was involved with the first ever Twitter tasting. I think Lucas Donoviak from Inverhouse ran one like almost a decade ago. And so an online tasting back then, I was already doing online group things. We were doing, Graham Linehan was doing online film watching, which he got banned from Twitter because he was tweeting too much and things like that. So it's been that. So over the last decade, we've seen this gradual acceptance of people doing more stuff online and group chats, and the technology's been building. We hit lockdown, Zoom became the most important company in the universe within 2 weeks. And so this became the norm, this sort of like chat. And I'd not really done very much to this before. I've been encouraging people to investigate video calling and group meetings online before. But within a month, I was running whiskey tastings online at work on a weekly basis. I'd be doing either the tech or the hosting of Zoom-based whiskey tastings, which we were broadcasting to Facebook. And selling packs of whiskey for it, and everybody sort of had to jump on that. And so from the industry, people various speeds accepted it, and from the consumer side, again, it was some people were onto it immediately, but it's just been the acceleration of acceptance as people have understood how it works. And so I think some people have been turned off by it. I know a lot of people who will not do anything virtual when it comes to whiskey at all. They have no urge to do it, and they just step away from it entirely. My whiskey club has not had a meeting for 8 months. We're in the process of organising a Christmas thing, but it's not like a normal tasting. Our Christmas tasting is normal anyway, so big charity thing we're trying to organise. But so some people have stepped away from it entirely, but other people, as you say, I think it's brought a few different people out. So it's a bit of a swings and roundabout situation. There's definitely some new people out there who we wouldn't have seen otherwise. There's definitely some people who've just been totally turned off by the whole thing.
Absolutely. I'm similar on myself. I love the social aspect of whiskey. So I love going to the festivals. I love meeting up with people in like a whiskey club, or I really enjoy speaking to distillers and that kind of thing. And that's been a shame. And I find it myself, even now, like I find it, if I was in person with you, I find it much easier to talk to, even with this whole screen. Some people are very comfortable with that, and I'm kind of like learning myself how to kind of interact with people through a screen. But on the whole, I think it's been pretty. I think the first proper festival I was involved with was the English Whisky Festival a couple of weeks back, which that was the first festival tasting I'd kind of joined, and I really enjoyed it. So I can certainly see the potential of it. And on that note, maybe we should. That's one thing I, of course, wanted to talk to you about was English whiskey. So with English whiskey, when did that? Of course, you've been involved in whiskey for a long time, and as you say, coming up to 10 years at the Whisky Exchange. When did English whiskey start to sort of ping up on your radar as something, rather than being a bit of a novelty or something that actually, hold on, there's some movement here, and this is something. Of course, the St George's Distillery back in 2006 of kicking things off. When did you actually think, hold on, there could be a bit of a movement happening here?
Well, I remember around the time that St George's appeared, I wasn't that interested in it, anything like that. I remember the first one which made me go, that there's stuff outside of Scotland, was some Danzy Jones, which was a Welsh whiskey liqueur, which I've now since discovered was done by a predecessor of Penderyn. And I've got the book somewhere by the guy who ran the company. It's called Dafydd and Goliath. And it's all about how he was arrested by the government, not because he was a drug dealer, but because he was under investigation by spies. I haven't read it yet. I've been told it's a fantastic, insane read by a man who went down for doing drug dealing at the back of his club that he used to run, where he used to make dodgy liqueurs. But anyway, so I've got this Danzy Jones. I got this new make spirit as well from the same, and it's like, oh, that's from Wales. They make spirits in Wales. Oh, what do we do in England? And I discovered that St George's existed. I didn't have any stuff from them. It's like, I think I hadn't even done chapter 1 at this point in time. You know, it's really early days.
Yeah.
So by the time I got sort of more interested in whiskey, I started seeing the St George's chapters come through. So that every 6 months they did another chapter, I think it was. And so we got to chapter 6, it was 3 years old, their first whiskey. I remember trying that and thinking, all right, this is not the same as Scotch whiskey. And of course, Scotch whiskey is the best whiskey. So for English people, whatever. But as I say to you earlier on, my first bottle of whiskey I bought as an investment was a bottle of English Whisky Chapter 11, which I still have because it's not worth any money, because I'm awful at whiskey investment. But from the early days of me, so about 10, 11, 12 years ago, when I started really becoming involved in the whiskey world and just looking at the whiskey world a lot more, that's when I really started noticing, okay, St George's is a different thing. They're doing something. And then I got involved with the London Distillery Company. A friend at the time, Darren Rook, started it. I was doing a podcast with him, and we had to stop the podcast because I got my job at the Whisky Exchange. He started the distillery. Alvin Gwilt, our camerawoman, went off to go and become the Balvenie brand ambassador. And my mate Jason went off to go live in Bristol and run a whiskey club down there. So to the winds. There are still some episodes of me and Jason's podcast around at villageofthe.drammed.co.uk for when we finally got back together again. But me and Darren and the gang sort of went off different ways. So I kept an eye on that distillery and then just watched that grow. And the thing which was most interesting about that was understanding the legal side of things. I met the guys at Sipsmith a little bit beforehand, and so they've been telling us about the fun and games of trying to get HMRC to allow them to have a still, which was smaller than a gigantic still, because they're saying, well, you have to have a big still. It's like, no, you don't. There's this little bit of text here at the bottom of the rules. And it's like, really? You didn't notice that before? And Alan Powell, who's one of the guys who was involved in the drafting of all of the distillery company and helped a lot of distillers back then, looking like a decade ago. He helped a lot of the distillers there understand the law. And London Distillery Company, one of their early problems was they couldn't get licensed properly because nobody had ever done it before. These days, you meant to get an answer, I think, in 30 days. It took 14 months for London Distillery Company, and that's 14 months of operating without the protection of duty suspension and things like that. So you have to pay tax on everything, which is not a thing you want to do. These days, all of that's been done, and those early people like Sipsmith pushing it through for gin, and London Distillery Company sort of pushing it through-ish. Eventually, people understood how it worked. I was saying before how we have people bimble along doing stuff, and St George's got a big still. They didn't use the small still sort of exceptions. Bumping along, and there's people try and do things, and then all of a sudden those difficulties have been conquered, and now we have different difficulties. But we've now just seen that explosion over the last few years.
I think
last 3 to 5 years is the time we've just seen so many new distilleries appear, because those problems that we were having beforehand have pretty much all gone away now on the legal side, allowing people to actually now focus on the other difficulties of funding and actually making stuff that tastes nice and all that sort of thing.
Because I did speak to Darren, formerly of the London Distillery Company, and he was saying the similar thing, that there was still sizes. It had to be a certain size, and anything underneath that was a real challenge. But then he was certainly saying that him and others that you mentioned had helped to change that law, where as long as you can prove that it's a commercially viable operation, that HMRC then kind of changed the laws around that. So really those kind of early guys seem to open the doors for now. There's Bimber in London and East London Liquor Company and others around the country, as you said, that just in the last few years have kind of exploded off the back of that, really. So it's pretty incredible, isn't it? If you think 2006, one distillery, and now I lose count. So I think we're around about 25, perhaps 26 at the moment. So it's
sounds about right. Well, it's not only that; it's the scale of them, because when you had the people like English Whisky Company, St George's Distillery, as they used to sort of flag themselves up as. That's quite a big operation. That they don't have the hugest stills in the world. And their still room is just one room, and it's quite dinky in comparison to Scotland. But it's still they are big stills. They are that they were the legal minimum before this sort of like, if you could, it wasn't so much an exception, it was just this is the size of a still above which you get approval. Below that is at the at HMRC's discretion, I think is the way they put it. So it came down to local offices having to understand distillation, and nobody understood that outside of Scotland. So that was the big problem around there. But so they've got a big one. But then you now look at people like Cotswolds. Cotswolds is not a small operation. Dan Zor is a man who comes from managing money. He understands how to do that and manage businesses, and so he created the big thing there. Then you get people like Spirit of Yorkshire. Farley Bay. That's not a little distillery. Again, that's come off the back of a brewing business and people who understand that process and put the money in there. When you get something like London Distillery Company, that was a guy who used to work in whiskey bars and did a bit of Whisky Ambassador work, and a serial investor in stuff, and a load of idiots who gave them money and now have no money left. That's different. So you can see that there's been a big change, and now that those obstacles have got out of the way, now the obstacle was legal. Can I even make spirit? Can I make spirit in a sustainable way due to the nature of paying duty and the way that you have to make spirits? Now it's, can I fund myself? Can I make nice things? How do we develop that rather than have to fight against the law? And I think that's the big thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure you've heard the news as well recently that one of the distilleries that makes English whiskey, Chase, were bought by Diageo. So now Diageo have entered the English whiskey market. Oh, of course, Chase are known for their gins and other stuff as well. But as part of their portfolio, there's whiskey. So now Diageo are part of the English whiskey game as well, which is quite a major development in the last few weeks.
At the same time, calling Chase an English whiskey distillery is actually, you probably find that the Chase family be slightly annoyed by that, but their whiskey, I've tried it when they first did some. I tried some new make, and I've tried various different times, and I've not seen any for a while. They are the kings of fruits and potatoes, but at the same time they're very good distillers, and so I always want to sort of try some more of their stuff. But no, Diageo have definitely sort of jumped on that. I know back from the LDC days, Distill Ventures, which is Diageo's investment sort of different company, totally separate, but not really, which is invested in various distilleries all over the world. They were sniffing around a variety of different London distilleries and asking people to submit things around English whiskey back then. I know that I don't think in the end anybody got picked up. I can't quite remember now, but it was a few years back. But no, so Diageo have been sort of interested in innovation for a long time, and things like Chase are a really established producer now. They won their San Francisco award for world's best vodka back before I started writing about booze, so that's over a decade ago. So they're more than 10 years old, and they have gone from being people who made Tyrrell's vodka after having just sold the Crisp brand, to making this incredible range of gins, which is one of the things they're really well known for now, as well as this incredible potato vodka in their beautiful still. So I think though it's a big thing that Diageo have definitely looked into the English market. They're based here. Well, they're sort of actually based there behind my monitor. I live on the site of the old Guinness factory. So okay. I live in Park Royal, 6 floors up above what used to be the Guinness Grand Met Social Centre, before it got closed down and knocked down.
You were saying earlier that you're kind of right near to Bimber as well, so you can maybe get some pipes channeled underneath into your.
So I've looked into the logistics of it. They're just slightly too far away. Unfortunately, I have to just
Well, see that little box that you've got behind you there, which is beautifully crafted, I must say, and that's kind of, that's a perfect point, that little box that's behind you there, which I think about a year ago you could pick up for, what was it, about £120, but now on auctions, someone was even saying to me that people are willing to pay about £2,000 for that first bottling in Europe now. Certainly on Whiskey Auctioneer and those kind of sites, I've seen it go for £1,000, and which, let's say if you went back to when you first started work at the Whisky Exchange and you were blogging about world whiskies, and someone said to you, I bet you £100 that in 10 years time, people will be buying English whiskey at auction, and if in the case of Bimber, things that go on sale will sell out in within minutes as soon as it's released online. Would you have thought they were crazy?
Oh no, it's just a really weird thing. Again, hindsight is a beautiful thing. As I said before, I would have bought so much Japanese whiskey if I knew what was going on.
Yeah.
I used to complain about the price of Hibiki 17. Oh, I wish I could buy Hibiki 17 for 65 quid still. No, Billy, it was not a £45 whiskey. Anyway, no, I think so. For instance, I've got some props. I've got this Bimber X bourbon cask. This is part of that first batch they put out there.
Yeah.
And I sit there going, do I go for the batch? So they get a big batch of bourbon casks. And I'm somebody who believes in the ability of blenders. And so single casks, I help do cask selection. If you try single cask, that's the easiest thing to choose. Here are 4 whiskies. Which one is best? This one. Excellent. We shall bottle that. Hooray, we win. If you do the thing where I'm going to bottle a batch and you go, okay, I've got 20 casks here. I have to choose 8 casks out of the 20, which means the best ones that when we vat them together, they're going to give the whiskey we want. And now we've got to choose the strength and everything like that. But I went for the single cask, and this stuff, just to make sure, it is open and it is being drunk.
I'm always in awe with people with distillers, like when they do that, when they are selecting. So I was very lucky that I just happened to be popping down to Bimber a while back, and Darius was there, and he had all of these samples out, and he was selecting things for their first release. And I got a little bit of an insight into his mind process, and I wish I could go back in time and actually kind of make some notes, and because it was fascinating, and I didn't want to disturb him for too long. But it's one of those whiskey moments that I'm going to remember. Actually, I was there when they were selecting their first release. It was quite nice.
The thing about these, and this is the thing that shocked me, was I was speaking to Matt Mackay, who does marketing for them. He's a friend of mine. He comes to my whiskey club, and he's sort of saying, "How long do you reckon it's going to be for how fast do you reckon they're going to go?" I was like, "I don't know, mate. It's all getting a bit silly." So, 10 minutes. He's going, "Wow, 10 minutes. That's going to be really." So it was 3 minutes. I think it was for all of them. I think it was 3 minutes for everything apart from the batch, and the batch took 4 minutes because that was 1,000 bottles, not 200. And it's absolutely insane. I went for the bourbon cask. Everybody else went for sherry casks and new oak. And it's like, I don't generally go for new oak or sherry cask if I could go for an ex-bourbon cask. And so I was lucky to get this one because I went for the less popular one. It's just
that would only sell out in 4 minutes.
Again, it's just
situation that's happening now with these guys. I don't know if you've with White Peak. So they just released this isn't actually a whiskey yet. It's they put it as English single malt. So it's only 2 years old, but they just released this. I think it was Sunday last weekend, and not quite. Of course, the Bimbers kind of sell out quickly, but within a couple of hours, I think 2 or 3 hours, they sold 500 bottles. You got some.
Okay. The joys of jury Reed lighting has just fallen over. There we go. Stop falling over crappy things I bought off Amazon. There we go.
So it's amazing this kind of thing that we're seeing now, that English whiskey is kind of been taken very seriously by not only, and I think these aren't just buyers within the UK. A lot of them are from around the world and in Europe. And I don't know if some of these distilleries are exporting to the USA. I know some of them have started, but the growth is quite phenomenal.
The US is a very difficult market for English whiskey because Scotland has got exemptions to allow them to use the Scotch whisky definition of whiskey.
Yeah.
So in America, whiskey has to be matured in a new oak cask. And so St. George's, for instance, had a small issue that there's a St. George's distillery in California, which is one of the many reasons why they are now the English Whisky Company. They always were, but they are very much so because it means they can export to the US. But they did their early ones had to be new oak. They had to be new oak matured English whiskey because that was just the American regulation. Japan had the same thing, but was able to get around it a few years ago. I'm fairly certain that that's still the case with English whiskey. It's things like if you look at Westland, who do single malt in America, they have to use new oak because that's the rules. And so, the American market's a bit of a different one. I know St. George's have got some stuff over there. I don't know how successful it's been. but I know Cotswolds got as far as Canada because I went to Canadian Whisky Festival a couple of years back and walked up to the Cotswolds stand and went, hello, to Dan, who was just standing there. It's like, what are you doing here? It's like, what are you doing here? It's like, well, I'm a whiskey writer. You're a whiskey person. I can see why we're both in the same place. But
it's how it works. I think I had a couple of people on it because I posted about Spirit of Yorkshire. I got some samples that came through, and a guy, from the States, someone that follows my page, said, oh, can we get this in the States? And I didn't know the answer. And I think perhaps Spirit of Yorkshire at that stage now where there's enough interest and they're like, okay, we want to figure about how we get it out to the US, but probably coming up with some of those obstacles right now.
Yeah, and again, there are such a range of sizes. You go from something like what London Distillery Company was, which is like, when they started was literally a shed on the side of an old ice house. And you get people like, Cooper King, who like built the distillery themselves. We're talking before about the Ludlow Distillery, which is a guy with a still in his barn. So you get like small little things like that. But then you get up to something like the Lakes or Cotswold or Spirit of Yorkshire, which are a different scale. And those guys are producing at such a scale that there is definite export potential. Bimber, I know, export to mainland Europe.
Yes.
I know of at least one single cask, well, one small batch release actually, which was meant to be significantly more than just Poland, which ended up being just Poland as it sold out within minutes, And again, you're going to put.
I think I know there was a recent one, and I was down at. I went to speak to Darius down at Bimber about something, and they had a bottling line, and this was just a few weeks back, and all of this stuff was just being done for Poland only, I think.
Well, if you're going to put moonshine on your label, because that's Bimber is Polish for moonshine.
Yes.
If you're going to put moonshine on your label, put it in a fancy bottle and shove it on a shelf in a fancy shop in Poland, it's going to sell. That's literally, And it's really, this is the thing, is that there's lots of markets which are opening up for whiskey in general, and Poland's one of them. I was over at a festival a couple of years ago now, where I was working for one of our sister companies, the Whisky Exchange, and it was thousands and thousands of people came through. It was an outdoor festival, and it was the most number of people I've ever seen at a whiskey festival. Beyond, it was music and whiskey, and they had to buy their own drams and from that, and we just sold loads and loads of whiskey. People just coming over and saying, "Hello, I don't speak English." I go, "Well, I don't speak Polish. Let's go find someone who can help us." And it was just people coming through, and so Bimber is perfect sort of import into that market from England because it has this Polish heritage, and so it fits into this new emerging whiskey market. Along with that, there are distilleries that are emerging in Poland as well, but they have a lot of the issues that we had back in the day. They have a very, very interesting, actually quite interesting legal structure around the way they do booze, which makes it really difficult for new smaller distillers to start up. So no, it's seeing that explosion and seeing. Now we've got over that hump, but at the same time, though, people don't like the English abroad. They're not. We're not the most popular people. All those things that we did. Yeah, we don't talk about those. But
do you think that's going to be an extra barrier to English whiskey get scaling up to the kind of? Do you think there'll ever be an English whiskey that is not that's ever going to rival, but that's ever going to be held as in high esteem as something like Macallan or Lefroy, or do you think there's the potential for something to reach that kind of height in the future?
Well, again, the issue with that is its history. Macallan built its reputation on bottlings from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's where Macallan grew. But it's also got a load of history, and so I know London Distillery Company was all about history of the thing which it was trying to continue from 109 years beforehand and all this sort of thing, but it's gone now, and no other English whiskey company has any particular history because we haven't had distilling in London for more than 110 years, maybe 120 years now. Well, that's when the last batch of distilling happened, was back at the turn of the 20th century. And so we don't have that history, and that's what those things are. That's when you get the Macallan, when you get the Glenlivets, the Glenfiddichs, these big names, even if they're not massively loved within the whiskey geek community, they are massively loved in the wider community. I think within the whiskey geek community, we're already seeing things like Bimber getting a load of love. People like White Peak and Toad, Oxford Artisan Distillery, they're getting a lot of love. East London Liquor Company, quite a lot of love, but that's also because people know them and they're all lovely over there. But then you get these little distilleries popping up. But you know, when you get, I have a stash of stuff from the lakes.
Yeah.
And if you speak to Davor Gandhi at the lakes for more than about 2 minutes, all of a sudden you go, okay, this is something interesting happening here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of potential, I think, for quality to, you know, hit the levels that we want.
Well, that's an interesting one you mentioned him, because he was ex Macallan, wasn't he? So I've been very, you know, one of my favourite. Actually, I said this. It sounds like I've got a lot of favourite English whiskies this year, but certainly one of my favourites was the Whiskey Makers Reserve No. 3. I don't know if you've tried that one. Is that the one you got there?
That would be the exact one I was just having a snort of.
I think that's a really, really lovely whiskey. It's a beautiful whiskey.
I haven't tried my sample yet. I just had a bit of a sniff. And again, this is this wonderful thing that within English whiskey, because the regulations are not quite as strict as Scotland.
Yeah.
Things like the Spirit of Yorkshire wouldn't be allowed to operate in Scotland because they make their wash up the hill, then tanker it down to the distillery. You have to produce everything on the same site in Scotland. And some of the things that Davor's coming up with as plans for the lakes are just things which you just can't do in Scotland. Everything is sort of borderline, and he'd probably get away with most of it in Scotland if he wanted to, but it's just totally untraditional stuff which they wouldn't even think of doing in Scotland, because somebody would obviously complain to the SWA, a letter would be sent, and whiskey would be slapped. And you know, if all of a sudden you say, right, I'm going to start maturing whiskey in amphora, what do you mean? I'm going to put some clay pots in this little cupboard underneath my my room here and see what happens. I come from, you know, these days I'm not only a whiskey guy, I do lots of other spirits, and one of the things I've done a lot of work with recently is shochu and awamori from Japan. And one of the things about shochu is that you can't age it in wood for very long because there's a limit on the depth of color, because Japanese law is basically you can't make it look like whiskey, you can't make it taste like brandy. That's basically the law for shochu and awamori. And so it's normally not aged in wood, it's normally aged in jars, and so, or inert vessels, and so it's aging. But traditionally when we talk about aging, we say, oh yeah, it's the wood having an effect in front of that. There's a whole other world of maturation which does not involve wood, and so people are now looking, you know, Davor's looking into that for English whiskey, because he's a nutter, but an appropriate nutter. And so
that's one of the things that's come up a lot with discussions I've had. Either, you know, there was things that talked like about this at the English Whisky Festival, and people I've spoken to, like yourself as well, recently in some of these interviews and talks that I've done with people. It's that open to experimentation that English whiskey has is quite an interest. And there's two arguments, or there's two thoughts. There's some that are a little bit more traditional, thinking, well, if we allow too much experimentation, then we're going to get loads of people making really duff whiskey, and it's going to really dampen the kind of view of English whiskey around the world. And there's going to be some that's great, some that's terrible. And that's one of the, myself personally, I'm very much for experimentation as long as the quality is kept. And maybe, you know, of course, there has to be some kind of guidelines. But I think it's a really exciting thing. You know, I can just, you mentioned Double there. I can imagine him in his kind of lab there doing all these kind of crazy experiments, and I think there might be some. I'm sure there'll be things that won't work, and there'll be some fantastic things that in 10 years' time other people are copying as well. So I think it's. Do you think that the climate in this country as well is going to play a part? Because obviously in Scotland and Ireland we have slightly colder conditions. Do you think there's the potential for maturation in this country is going to be a bit quicker? So we're going to see some interesting things happening there as well.
Not really. The difference we have between us and Scotland and Ireland, especially south of Ireland, you know, that's basically the same as most of England, you know, when it comes to sort of like climate. The only time you really see those big changes when you actually start getting major changes in the climate. If you start going to India, where you have ridiculous temperature and ridiculous humidity variations. Listening to a podcast earlier on, listening to Ashok Chukalingam from Amrit talking about it, and he was saying they're 3,000 feet up in Bangalore, which means they're 3,000 feet away from the sea vertically, as well as being, you know, not that far away from, not that close to the sea anyway. And they're massively dry. There's almost no humidity, and so in that situation, your cask is going to be operating very, very differently than if it was humid. The humidity in England and Scotland and Ireland is all very similar. It's all very traditional, sort of like, you know, places to mature whiskey. So nothing that's going to change so much. But I think it will come down to how people store things, because in Ireland and Scotland, they have the traditional types of warehousing. You get your dunnage, you get your racks, you get your palletized warehousing. In England, because we see such a wide variety of different distilleries doing different things, you know, Bimber storing their stuff along the back wall of a warehouse in Park Royal next door to a garage where cars get burnt out opposite every now and again.
And using London
you
tap
compare that. So,
and using London tap water.
Finest tap water in the UK, if you ask me. I am biased because I do live in London and have done for many years. But you compare that to Ludlow, maturing whiskey in a barn and every now and again taking a load out to sell and then refilling it. That's, yeah, he's got a weird, some kind of sort of strange Solera vat going on in a shed somewhere over in the countryside. You know, it's very, I think that's the thing we're going to see, because Scotland is very much more traditional. You get some people like the Thompson brothers in Dornoch who have a shipping container they were using as a warehouse. And so they were maturing their cask, which they rolled into a shipping container, which is quite difficult to sample out of here. But yeah, that's not the norm in Scotland. They have warehousing, they have established warehousing, and they have commercial warehousing that you can rent space in. In England, there is a bit of that as well, but there is also a lot more variation, and I think that is where they're going to see the interesting stuff in maturation. And
one thing I'm going to actually having a chat with Alistair Sims, I think, I don't know if there's been other coopers that have come along, but I know that he's the last master cooper in England. So I'm going to be chatting to him, I think, tomorrow. So I'm wondering if now, with the kind of the growth of English whiskey distilleries, if there's going to be some exciting things there, because you mentioned that the freedom of trying different woods and different casks, you know, we're looking at, I know some are doing chestnut and all sorts of things. So I wonder if there's going to be a bit of an industry that's growing, or certainly employing more people in cooperages and things like that. If that'd be quite interesting.
Yeah, there's still a load of capacity within cooperage, and the problem is actually the coopers themselves aren't the bottleneck. It's actually getting in the cask from outside, which is often the bottleneck. I know Alistair Sims, wasn't it? I've never spoken to him. I haven't heard his name for years. And you said it, I was like, oh, him, the cooper guy. Yeah, he lots of cool stuff that he's played around with, and he does interesting cooperage. And it's not so much for the whiskey industry, but I know TLDC were doing some stuff with him, and he looked over some wood for them, and he does particularly high-end casks. But if you look at across what people in the English whiskey world are doing, there's a lot of the influence of Jim Swan. Obviously, Dr. Jim Swan passed away a few years ago, very much the father of early maturation. I don't like the idea of people saying fast maturation. Things mature at the rate of 1 year per year. That's just literally the nature of time. You can't change that. But what you can do is you can change the way that it matures at a younger age. And so he came with STR casks, shaved toasted recharred casks, which he pioneered over in Taiwan, and which they now use across everywhere. You know, the Cotswolds released an STR cask a little while back.
I think I've got one from Spirit of Yorkshire here somewhere as well.
I know they got. I tried some of their STR stuff, you know, after a few months, and it was great. But again, if you look around Spirit of Yorkshire, they've got orange wine casks and things like that. And orange wine is this thing that's been popped up recently, because I think the Lakes has done one, yeah. But where did that come from? All of a sudden, orange wine. That's the stuff which I know that Spirit Yorkshire, Lakes have been playing around with. The Lakes do lots of bits of weird and wonderful wood, because that's sort of Daval's thing, is he starts with the flavours he wants from the oak and then works backwards.
Yeah.
And I know Cotswolds themselves, they got the down telling tales of that time they got those Calvados casks and have to drive them all the way back to the Cotswolds from France, and you know, and the people who are playing, you know, people are doing stuff. I know that TLDC were playing around trying to do English oak, and that's where they're speaking to Alistair, was to get English oak. I don't know what happens to that in the end.
Well, I know. So I think, the London Distillery Company started playing around with, I think they were the first, weren't they, to start using English oak, I believe. And then The one that's really behind it now, that I've heard about, is the Oxford Artisan Distillery. I know they're using quite a lot of. I don't know if they're solely using it, but in a lot of their production, I think they're using English oak. I tasted this feature rye, their first release, which was matured in English oak, and I don't know. There were similarities actually between this and the London Distillery Company rye that I tasted. I picked up certain, and so both had been aged in English oak, and there was a herbalness to it. I was described almost like a kind of Ricola kind of, those Ricola sweets, and there was something, but it was something a bit deeper, a bit more herbal. And they're the only two experiences I have of English oak casks. So I've got not a broad thing to compare it to, but between those two, I'm already seeing a little bit of similarity there.
Yeah, I think it's more of the focus on the rye, because I know that herbal note is something I always get from rye whiskies, and I know from the London Distillery Company rye I've tried in the past, even back to the new make, it's got this very, very, very sort of herbal character.
Yeah.
So my lovely cask of London Distillery Company stuff, with my name on it and everything.
Oh,
so
nice.
I've got a few bottles of this left still, of my 28, not 26. But this stuff, again, looking at different things which we can do over here. So this was focusing on Plumage Archer barley and 1920s distillers yeast and Whitbread B brewers yeast. So again, there's a lot of these manipulation in Scotland. There's always there's always like a thing we talk about in the whiskey world every year, and every year it's going to be yeast. This year we're going to talk about yeast. We never talk about yeast, never. And so already there's some folks over here in England now talking about it. Although I know the guys at Spirit of Yorkshire do. They come from a brewing background, so you'd expect them to. London Distillery Company did. And more people are experimenting along those sorts of sides. If you look to America and you said to an American distiller, "Oh, we just use standard yeast. Do you do that?" They'd probably punch you. It's so different and so against the way they make whiskey. It's all they right at the beginning that yeast is a thing, whereas in Scotland that's become less and less so. They just work with what they have there, and then just tweak other parameters. And that's not a bad thing. That's you choose what you're going to change. But it's nice to see again part of that experimentation in England is all areas of production from the beginning all the way through.
Yeah. So I mean, from your point of view, it seems that you're quite all behind English whiskey and they're kind of a bit excited about where it could be going. And out of what you've tried either personally or through your work with the Whisky Exchange and various tastings. And I know that you were attending the English Whisky Festival a couple of weeks ago. That's how we got in touch, actually, because I sort of saw you popped up on the chat and we had a quick chat about London Distillery Company and things and a couple of other whiskies and things. And have you picked out any favourites yourself that ones to watch for the future that you thought, actually, I'm really enjoying these, and I think these are my top picks of the ones I've tried?
It's a lot of names that have come up already. I do have my favourites, and they're quite obvious when I sort of my borderline hero worship of Davil Gandhi and all this sort of thing. But
there's a lot of hero worshippers for him, actually. He's I was talking to Swedish Whiskey Girl, who's got a really great YouTube channel and Instagram page, and she said, when she kind of, I don't know if she spoke to him or did an interview, but she was saying, I kind of fangirled out over Davil. So it's got quite a lot of fans.
The thing for me is that I'm he's a very interesting man to speak to when it comes to his approach to making things. Outside of the whiskey world, just in general, he has very interesting philosophy of creation, which is really, really great to talk to someone. I'm very interested in such things, and so it was great to that. We now swap coffee tips every now and again because he's a bit of a coffee geek like I am. But my thing about his whiskies is that it's what the next step is. He is creating products which are great, and this is I hate the word product when we talk about whiskey because I don't like things being products. That's just pigeonholes into a thing. I like whiskey being a thing that I love and everything like that. A product is a packaged thing which you sell, but that's what they are in the end. And it's at the moment he's doing these little products, which are things which he's pulled together from what he's got. My thing I want to see what he does next is how he turns that into ongoing products and how those expressions develop, and how I've heard some tales from them about how they want to do things, and that through his approach to creation, I can see that working really well. And that's my thing I'm really interested in, is to see how he and his team, because he's got a fantastic team. If you ever get a chance to go to Cotswolds and have a chat with the gang, they spot on for understanding his approach to whiskey making and just his approach to creation, which is marvelous, is see how the team develop things coming up.
Yeah.
And to go to the other end of things, outside of Bimber, because they're my local and they're mates, and that's just cheating. The people to keep an eye on, and this is one which is a strange one for me to say you should keep an eye on, is the English Whisky Company, because David Fitt is one of the best distillers in the UK, not just England, but Scotland as well. He is an incredibly good distiller. And while people talk about the experimentation in other distilleries, they don't often talk about the experimentation that they do at St. George's.
Yeah.
I visited on a day that I'm fairly certain he was trying to make bourbon, a corn mash whiskey. And it's like, David, this doesn't look like stop looking in my mash tun. And if you look at the grain whiskies they've done, David's a brewer. And so he's come at it from a brewer's perspective, and has started using mash bills and grains and different grains to create these grain whiskies, which are really, really good, really complex, and it's all flavor coming from the early stage of the process and coming through. And also, if you look at the very, very boring standard single malt bourbon cask whiskies he's doing, like the 11-year-old, they're stunning. They are some of the best distillate ever. The ones I don't like from them are their wine casks and their weird and wonderful things like that, which people go on about. The casks are really good, but I can't taste the spirit. But he's also doing lots of experiments with other casks in there as well. I can't remember the exact details. I'm not entirely certain what I'm allowed to say, but they are playing around with their own casks and creating this sort of thing there as well. They're a lot more experimental than you expect from the old boys.
Oh yeah, and I've become actually I've got, I think their first release here, but one, did you try for the English Whisky Festival a couple of weeks back? Did you try the peated cask that was the festival bottling? Did you try that one?
No, I didn't. Was it peated cask or peated spirit?
Peated cask. It was. This is. I think it's 11-year-old. It was a festival bottling that they've released. I think it's wonderful. It's so rich and dark, and you get the peat, but it's not overbearing. It's just a beautifully balanced whiskey, and I thought that was a stunning whiskey. And I think it was about 11-year-old. And that's the thing about the English Whisky Company. Of course, they're the oldest English distillery, so they've got all these things that are now 10 years plus that are starting to get some really interesting characteristics. And I thought that, I really recommend checking that out actually. And if we ever get to meet up in person as well at some point, it's a while, but I'll bring some samples because it's. I thought it was a stunning.
The thing about the English Whisky Company again is the fact about English whiskey in general is we keep on talking about how young whiskey can be good, because the big thing for years was always old whiskey is better whiskey, because we had a load of old whiskey to shift, and therefore we had to make it sure we could get rid of it. Whiskey is a spectrum of flavor from young to old, and there are good things at every single age of whiskey. And English whiskey is at a stage where we don't have much older English whiskey, and the distilleries themselves and the whiskies themselves have been designed to work at a younger age. That's how they've been put together, is deliberately to work younger. Cotswold stuff with the STRs and the way they work there was designed to hit the ground running at 3 years old, and you could buy it and it would taste good then. English Whisky Company didn't have that so much, but their whiskies are now really starting to come into their own as they get older. Bimber, I want to try Bimber at 15 years old. I want to try a refill bourbon cask Bimber at 15 years old, because I think that is going to be absolutely stunning. And that's the thing, is that we are at the stage at the moment where the whiskey is youthful and has a certain character and is interesting and is good. But there's a whole load more for us to still see, and the stuff that's coming out of English Whisky Company is showing what that potential future could be.
Well, this is one of the reasons, a great point there, this is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in English whiskey, because at this stage already things are tasting so good, and it's not just one or two here or there are good, the others are a bit, there's some consistency, there's some great spirit being made. But I remember when I first started getting into whiskey a bit more seriously, and you go to a whiskey shop, it might be Whisky Exchange, or I'd be at a whiskey festival, and you see a Scotch whiskey, and it's like 7-year-old, and I'd be like, oh gosh, that's young, or 8 years old, that's oh gosh, that can't be any good. And I was of that same kind of thing, And it's only really since trying a lot of these English whiskies that as I say here, this 2 years old, and it's put out as an English malt spirit. The other thing, even some of the new makes, before English Whisky, I'd never tried so many new make spirits. Now some of them are even bottling the new make spirits and selling it. And now, oddly enough, you see some Scottish distilleries doing the same thing, which is quite strange.
I spent a large amount of time trying to obtain new make years ago, and it's a lot easier than it used to be. So
yeah, absolutely. Well,
I've got some Bimber new make there, which they sent out to the Bimber Club members,
which is phenomenal. I suppose certain thing you can judge from a new make spirit, but in terms of a stat, I quite enjoy Bimber new make spirit as a standalone drink. I still say some of the two best new make spirits I've tried is Lefroy new make spirit when I visited Islay about a year or so ago, and Bimber. They're the two best new make spirits I've it's not to say they're the best, but my personal favourites, side by side, Lefroy and Bimber. Amazing.
Yeah, definitely. And this is the thing. I remember trying the Bimber new make and trying the London Distillery Company new make.
Yeah.
The LDC stuff was slightly different because it was the first ever distillation, and I literally put my hand underneath the spout of the still and went no, and which is a slightly different experience to the thing. I can't remember the guy's name. It wasn't Mike Nicholson. It was one of the sort of the former distillery guys who come down just to keep an eye on this first whiskey run, just to make sure it was working. Sat on a stool by the thing as a stuff. Basically, going to dump it. It was not ever going to be an actual run. It was just running the first run to see how it worked. He was just sat there going, "It's right," and it was absolutely hilarious. You're watching this thing and sort of trying but the spirit itself was still really good. I've tried a variety of their spirits over time, and again, different and interesting and like that, and you can see that across a lot of the distilleries in England, again, because of this focus on youthfulness and young, being able to sell their stuff young and being able to develop that young. And so you do get these new makes which work better younger. I think it's I've heard people say they really like Lagavulin new make. The one time I tried it, I absolutely despised it. I just tried it and went, no, I can't drink that.
Are you still there, buddy? You've frozen up.
Okay. I'm fine.
Can you hear me? Your video is just frozen up there.
World.
There you go.
Also,
Sorry,
still there, yeah.
The video just froze up for a second. It might be my internet's unstable. I don't know. Sorry about that. I just missed the last sort of 10 seconds of what you said there.
Oh, basically, I'm just saying, jumping onto the whole thing of how bringing in this learning from outside of sort of tradition, Western tradition, things like that. He's saying about some spirits that you can drink off the still, things like that. When I was over in Japan trying these Japanese spirits, you can't drink them when they're done. They are horrible. They're borderline toxic, I tried some spirit. Well, didn't quite try it because I couldn't get it close enough to my face to put it into my mouth. Off of a wooden pot still. And it was a sweet potato mash shochu, which had been fermented and distilled in a pot still. And they said, "Oh yeah, this is yesterday's distillation." Threw the plastic cover off the pot, and basically it stank of cabbage and farts. It just came straight out of the thing. And I tried that same spirit after it had been in a tank for a year, and it was beautiful. And again, it's the understanding of, okay, if we have something like Lagavulin 16, that has not only had 16 years of cask maturation, it has 16 years of transformative maturation in the cask, not only the cask influence.
Yeah.
And so the spirits we have currently in England are focused on, a lot of them are focused on that youth thing. And so I want to see what happens when we get to those older ages and see how those then actually develop.
Well, that's the reason I'm kind of trying to chart all this kind of stuff now, so we can look back on this in a few years' time and see where it will end up. And one thing I'm going to need to change my subscription with Zoom, I think, because one last question for you, Billy. With the rise of English whiskey, and we're seeing more and more distilleries, around about 24, 25 distilleries that are now producing whiskey. How long do you think it will be until we see shops and also websites with a category just dedicated to English whiskey, like there is for Scotch or Irish or American whiskey? How long do you think, how far off are we for an English whiskey category?
I think we're really on the cusp. We have an English whiskey page on the Whisky Exchange website. We have done, I think, since we had St. George's just on its own. We're an English company, despite being known for Scotch whisky, but we support other English companies in the whisky world. But I think we're almost there. We've got a few folks who are in Waitrose. You're seeing stuff up in the Sainsbury's. I know we've got the guys from Spirit of Yorkshire up in Booths, up north. The thing we need there to be enough distilleries producing for there to actually be more than just a handful. And already, we've got probably 5 or 6 distilleries who have got whisky or something close to whisky, which means we're already got more diversity than both Campbelltown and the Lowlands in Scotland. We probably don't have the production levels. But it really is a case of, I think we're on the cusp of English whisky becoming what it's going to become. It's on the edge of the mainstream. It's already known. It's just, where it goes next.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight, Bill. I really appreciate your time. And, it's great to speak to someone with your experience and expertise in whisky, and especially on the subject of English whisky. So, thank you so much for joining me tonight.